Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We're continuing to read through Imam al-Nawawi's Etiquette with the Quran, At-Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran. We're in the chapter related to the etiquette of recitation. And yesterday we read some segments about changing from one canonical recitation to another, and the requirement that we read only from the authentic and mutually agreed upon by consensus canonical recitations, these 7 recitations. And I listed them yesterday. And if you want the names, you can either find them in yesterday's clip or you can turn to the appropriate footnote at the end of your book. Okay. Next, Imam al-Nawawi talks about reciting the Quran in order. And he's going to go through several different possibilities. Now, the general rule is that we should recite the Quran in order. We should start with al-Fatiha, and then we should go to al-Baqarah, and then Ali Imran, and so forth until we get to the very end. And then we start again with al-Fatiha. So the general rule is that we should be reciting the Quran in order. We can skip and recite individual surahs if we want. And we can also recite surahs in the opposite order, meaning we recite a later surah and then an earlier one. That's something that also can be done even if it's not the best. Okay, so the general order is that we want to recite the surahs in the order in which they appear in the Mus'haf, and that we would also recite adjacent surahs. Okay, as a general rule, this is what's best. Yes, you can violate the order if you want, and if you have a reason to do so, and Imam al-Nawawi is going to give us some reasons when it is best to actually go against the typical order. Now, those are the obvious cases, right? But then we also have some other weird cases that he's going to mention. So what about reciting a surah of the Quran, starting with the last letter of the surah, and ending with the first? Or what about reciting an ayah of the Quran, starting with the very last letter, and then going to the first? So what's the ruling of that? He will give that. What about reciting the ayat from beginning to end, but reversing the order of the ayat within the surah? So starting with the very last ayah, then the next last, then the one before it, and then the one before it. He's going to talk about that too. Okay, so he's going to talk about several possibilities. He's going to talk about the possibility of reciting a surah from beginning to last, and then reciting the surah that follows it, or reciting the surah that comes before it. He'll talk about that. So the general order of surah or chapters of the Quran. And he's also going to talk about order within a surah. And then he's going to talk about order within an ayah itself. So he's going to look at those 3 different levels. And this little preamble there is just to make it a little bit easier to understand the issues when he brings it up. So, those are the things he's going to cover next. And he says, Rahimahullah, the scholar said that it is better to recite following the order of the Mus'haf, the text of the Quran. For example, one recites al-Fatiha, then al-Baqarah, then Ali Imran, then what follows according to the order, whether or not one recites during prayer. Some of our Shafi companions even said that if he recited Surah An-Nas in the first rak'ah, he should recite Surah al-Baqarah in the second after al-Fatiha. Okay, so he loops around. How much he recites of Surah al-Baqarah, that will come later. But the idea, as we know, is that usually your second rak'ah will be a little bit shorter than the first. So even if one Okay, so his general rule is that we're going to recite in the order of the surahs in the Quran, and we're going to respect that even if we were to recite the last surah of the Quran in the first rak'ah, and the next rak'ah, after reciting al-Fatiha, we would then recite Surah al-Baqarah. Okay. Some of our Shafi companions have said it is recommended that when one recites a chapter, he should read what follows it immediately. Support for this is the fact that the Mus'haf's order was arranged this way purely out of divine wisdom. So Allah wanted something. He put it in the order that it did because there is a meaning or a wisdom in there that we will get from it. When it's in that order, we will get something when it's in that order and not in another order. Okay? And if you go against that order, you're not going to get part of what Allah wanted us to get out of it. Okay, support for this is in the fact that the Mus'haf's order was arranged this way purely out of divine wisdom. Also, he is using something that's covered in Aqidah and in Ulum al-Quran, that the order of the Quran is from Allah, it's not from human beings. So some people say, oh, we have the surahs in the particular order they are because it's from longest to shortest. It happens to be that way as a general rule, yes. It's not absolute. As a general rule, yes, but that order is from Allah. And it's the order that, one of the things about it being from Allah is that we're not allowed to change it then. Okay, so one should preserve the order with the exceptions mentioned in the Sharia, such as the morning prayer on Friday, in which one recites Surah Sajda in the first rak'ah, and in the second rak'ah, Surah al-Insan. So here he skips from the 32nd surah to the 76th surah. So here he's not reading what comes immediately after what he read in the first rak'ah. And then the second one he says is the Eid prayer, in which Surah Qaf is recited in the first rak'ah, and in the second rak'ah, Surah al-Qamar. So he skips 3 surahs. So he reads Surah Qaf, which is the 50th, and then he's going to read Surah al-Qamar, which is the 54th. And in the Sunnah Raka'at of the morning prayer, in which Surah al-Kafirun is recited in the first rak'ah, and in the second, Surah al-Ikhlas. Okay, so this is also a Sunnah to do that. So you read the 109th, and then you read the 112th. And also in the Raka'at of Witr prayer, in which Surah al-A'la is recited in the first rak'ah, and then Surah al-Kafirun in the second, and in the third, Surah al-Ikhlas, Surah al-Falaq, and Surah al-Nas. So in Witr prayer, in the first rak'ah out of the 3 rak'ah, okay, and notice the assumption here is that he's doing Surah Witr prayer as 3 rak'ah. And as we know in the Shafi madhab, you've got the option to do just 1 rak'ah. But what's better is to do 3. So if someone is doing 3 rak'ah for Witr prayer, what he should do is in the first rak'ah, he'll recite Surah al-A'la, and then in the second, he's going to recite Surah al-Kafirun. So he's going to skip from the 87th to the 109th surah. So that's a bit of a skip, right? So he's not reciting adjacent surahs. And then in the third, he's going to skip from 109 to 112. Okay, so he's skipping a few, and then he's going to do Surah al-Ikhlas and Surah al-Falaq and Surah al-Nas. So what Imam al-Nawawi has done is he's laid down the general rule, and then he has told us there's some cases that we know from the example of the Prophet ﷺ where we don't actually keep that order. We don't recite what's adjacent, and we might not even recite in the absolute order of the Quran. And the examples he gave were for the morning prayer on Friday, and the Eid prayer, and the 2 Sunnah Rak'at, the morning prayer, and then the Rak'at of Witr prayer. And then he goes, it is permissible to forego the order by reading a chapter that does not immediately follow it, or by reading a chapter and then any before it. So this is permissible to do. So if for some reason you want to read one surah and then you want to read a different one that comes after it. It's not adjacent, but it comes after, or it precedes it. This is permissible to do. Many accounts have been related concerning this, and Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu recited Surah al-Kahf in the first rak'ah of morning prayer and Surah Yusuf in the second. So he went backwards. First he read Surah Kahf, which is the 18th, and then he read Surah Yusuf, which is the 12th. And really, it's not, although it is rationally possible and it's conceivable that Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu would have done something that he knew that was not right, it's really, it's not likely. Okay, so Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, his performance is assumed to be correct because we know that the Sahaba, especially the Khulafa al-Rashidin, were pious individuals, and they were the closest to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they were the direct inheritors of his knowledge. And so if they did something like this, then it would be an indicator that it was permissible. So Imam al-Nawawi provides evidence for the permissibility of what he just said. And his evidence is from the actions of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, in this case Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. Okay, next he says, some scholars disliked violating the order of the Mus'haf altogether. Okay, so he moved from the issue of it being permissible to recite one surah and then reciting a surah that comes before it, or skipping and reciting a surah that's not adjacent to the one that was just read. Okay, so some scholars disliked violating the order of the Mus'haf altogether. Ibn Abi Dawood related from al-Hasan al-Basri that he disliked violating the order of the Mus'haf. He related with his rigorously authenticated chain, a Sahih chain, that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, may Allah be pleased with him, was informed of an individual who recites passages of the Quran in reverse order, and he said, this will invert his heart. Okay, it will turn his heart upside down by doing this. And here he was talking about someone reciting from the end of an ayah to the beginning of an ayah. Okay, so this is a strong indicator that this is considered impermissible to do. So reciting an ayah in reverse order is something that is not done. It's strongly disliked, if not unlawful. As for reciting a chapter from its end to its beginning, so here the ayah is recited in order, but you're reciting from the last ayah to the first ayah. As for reciting a chapter from its end to its beginning, this is categorically forbidden, since it removes aspects of the Qur'an's inimitability, its i'jaz, and negates the wisdom invested in the specific ordering of the verses. Ibn Abi Dawood related from Imam Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, the honorable tabi'i or successor, and from Imam Malik ibn Anas, that they both disliked this. And in their generation, when they say that they disliked something, it's understood that if they had just a little bit more evidence, they would declare it unlawful. So it's something that they strongly believed there was something wrong with it, but they didn't have that final definitive proof that would then enable them to declare it haram. And out of their precaution and concern for their akhirah, and also out of wanting to ensure that they convey the best information to us, and out of nasiha, they're not going to inflate a ruling without having a justification a sufficient justification for doing so. So even though they were pretty sure there's something wrong with it and they were going to treat it as such, they didn't have enough objective evidence that they could prove it to other people. So they would declare that they disliked it instead of outright saying that it was haram. So anyways, this is something to keep in mind whenever you hear that a companion or a tabi'i or one of the great imams, one of the early imams, the founders of the madhabs, if they say that they disliked something, then we need to treat it with more precaution than when we read in a fiqh book that something is disliked or makruh or offensive. We need to treat it as something even stronger. Okay, so anyways, enough of that. Ibn Abi Dawood related from Imam Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, the honorable tabi'i, and from Imam Malik ibn Anas, rahimahullah, that they both disliked this and that Malik reprimanded the practice and said that it was appalling. Okay, so he's now covered issues like reciting an ayah in reverse order, reciting a surah in reverse order, even though each of the ayat are read in correct order. And then he's going to talk about an issue that is pretty important. Okay? When we go and we start memorizing the Quran, or when we start teaching Quran to children, we don't start with al-Fatiha and then al-Baqarah. What we typically do is we're going to start with Juz Amma, the last Juz of the Quran, the last 30th of the Quran, and we're usually going to start with the smallest surahs. And we might not even do Juz Amma in order, because we want to give children something small that they can finish. And one of the reasons that we concentrate on small things is that you have that sense of accomplishment. And once you've accomplished one thing, then you'll want to accomplish another, and you'll want to accomplish another. All right, so if we started with Surah Al-Baqarah, it is going to be quite a while before the kids stop, before they reach the end. And my guess is that if the first thing we ever memorized was Surah Al-Baqarah, a lot of us wouldn't finish. We would kind of lose hope of doing it. And so a wiser plan when it comes to teaching kids and people beginning to memorize is you start with small achievements and then you slowly build towards bigger ones. So you start with really small surahs, and the surahs that you've heard so much that it's really easy to memorize. So you'd start with al-Fatiha because they've heard it throughout their small number of years, and because they're going to need it in every prayer, we'll start with al-Fatiha. And then maybe we'll do either al-Asr, or we'll do an-Nas, or al-Insan, Surah al-Nas and al-Ikhlas. We'll do the last ones, right? Okay, because they're small. And then we'll gradually move them up to bigger things. So what about that? Because what we read so far doesn't definitely say there's something okay with it. It hints that it might be something we shouldn't do. So Imam al-Nawawi is going to address that, and he says, teaching children from the end of the Mus'haf, and here when he says children, what I've always understood is that he would use the word children here because it's the most likely case during his time. So it's not a necessary restrictive qualifier. And it's not that this ruling applies only to kids. Okay, so teaching children, I would say that teaching beginners or novices or anyone else where the same wisdom is going to apply. Okay, so teaching people who are beginning to memorize the Quran. From the end of the Mus'haf moving towards its beginning is good and is not relevant to this discussion since it is a discontinuous recitation throughout several days. In addition, it makes it easier for children to memorize. So there's two reasons that he mentions this. One is facilitating memorization. So that's one of the reasons for him to say that. And another reason that he says this is that when it is done, it's not a single recitation. You recite from the very last surah, and then the next day you come back and you recite from a surah before it. This isn't one recitation. It's discontinued, interrupted recitations. That's with a plural. So you're not violating the order that way. So anyways, when it comes to teaching people, yes, it is permissible for you to start with the smallest surah and then gradually increase the size. So for folks like me who need to sit down and do some more memorization, start with the next smallest thing that you have to do and build up momentum. Okay, we can use our own psychology in our favor here. Sorry, we have a visitor. Hello, Alpha. Okay, so next, after he's talking about memorization, it's only appropriate that he should get into the issue of whether it's better to recite from memory or to recite from the Mus'haf, even if you've memorized. So Imam al-Nawawi says, reciting the Quran from the Mus'haf, the text of the Quran, is better than reciting from memory, since looking in the Mus'haf is a kind of worship that one should seek out, for it combines recitation and looking. Okay, so reciting from looking at the Mus'haf itself, looking at the Quran, is considered an act of worship that we should engage in. So if you have beautiful Quranic calligraphy on your wall, yes, looking at it is considered an act of worship. Okay, opening the Mus'haf and just reading a page or reading passages, looking at passages, the looking itself is considered an act of worship. Okay, so that's one of the reasons for preferring reciting from the text, the written text of the Quran, over only from memory. Okay, so he says reciting from the written Mus'haf is better than reciting from memory, since looking in the Mus'haf is a kind of worship that one should seek out. And it thus combines recitation, which is a form of worship, and looking from the Mus'haf, which is a form of worship. So combining the two, you get this combo multiplier, and inshallah you will rack up more thawab by doing it. This is what some of our Shafi companions, Al-Qadi Hussein, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and groups of the righteous forebears, the Salaf al-Salih, have said. Okay, so we've got a group of Shafi'is who considered it better to mix the two together. So even if you had memorized the Quran, there would be a reason to still recite from the Mus'haf. There's other reasons too. I mean, if you memorize the Quran and you recite from the Mus'haf, you also have an additional opportunity to detect if you have some flaws in your memory. And as people get older, the possibility of this does start to increase. Okay. So he mentioned that Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was one of the people that went with this opinion, and then he's going to mention Hujjat al-Islam again. He says, Al-Imam al-Ghazali and al-Ihya cites that many of the companions, may Allah be pleased with them, recited from the Mus'haf and found it reprehensible that a single day would pass by without looking in the Mus'haf. So not only is it a form of ibadah, it's one of the daily ibadat that we should seek out. Now, this might not be the official position of the madhab, but that doesn't prevent us from still wanting to do it. Okay, so maybe we won't keep it at the level of something that is really a daily obligatory act, but that some people consider it to be something that is obligatory, or that it would be reprehensible not to do it during the day. Those are enticements and reasons for us to seek it out. Okay, so Al-Imam al-Ghazali in Ihya al-Madin cites that many of the companions, may Allah be pleased with them, recited from the Mus'haf and found it reprehensible that a single day would pass without looking in the Mus'haf. Now, something to get here is that it does show then that, yes, scholars, Shafi scholars would quote the Ihya. Okay? Other fuqaha would quote the Ihya. But just because he quotes it here doesn't mean that it is the final authority when it comes to the fiqh of Imam al-Ghazali. Because we need to keep in mind that Imam al-Ghazali worked on several different fiqh books throughout his life. And some of them he quotes in the Ihya, but then there's also some books where he refers back to the Ihya. So like in Kitab al-Basit, I'm sorry, is it the Basit? No, in al-Wasit, which is his second or third fiqh book, second or third in chronological order. Way back in the Book of Marriage, he refers us back to the Ihya. What this tells us is that, yes, there's a chronic, what this tells us is that the Ihya isn't the final thing that he worked at when it came in fiqh. So yeah, we're going to find that Shafi scholars will quote from the Ihya sometimes, but there's later books of Imam al-Ghazali that are considered more authoritative when it comes to fiqh rulings. So anyways, just a little fa'idah. So Al-Imam al-Ghazali in Al-Ihya cites that many of the companions, may Allah be pleased with them, recited from the Mus'haf and found it reprehensible that a single day would pass them without looking in the Mus'haf. Ibn Abi Dawud related accounts from many of the Salaf as-Salih that they recited from the Mus'haf, and I myself do not see any disagreement therein. So even though they were assumed to be memorizers of the Quran, and even though finding a Mus'haf to read out of, it's not going to be the most common thing in their day. Now, there might have been plenty, but it wasn't a mass-produced item like we have today. Back in their day, the Mus'haf had to be written by hand, and that takes a lot of time. Today, you can go down to the grocery store. In Muslim-heavy countries, you can go to the grocery store and you can pick up a Mus'haf because it's so easy to obtain. And when things are plentiful, we put less value on them. So anyways, even in their age where finding the written Mus'haf was not going to be as easy as it is today, it was still something that they made a point of doing every single day. And for us, because it's really easy to see, we don't value it as much. Okay. So, and by the way, even if they didn't have a full Mus'haf in their own possession, Quran was written in public spaces. Like in the mosque, there might be passages written that they could look at. The whole point is that it's something that they would still aim to do. So people that have Quranic art on the wall, look at it as a form of ibadah. Okay, so when you look at it and you appreciate it, don't only have hamd, that you have it in your house, and don't only have hamd and appreciation of the calligrapher's skill, look at it as being kalam Allah and as a form of worship, just to look at it. Okay, enough of this, all right? It may be said that this differs according to different people. Reciting from the Mus'haf is the preferred way for someone who finds having veneration of Allah and pondering the Quran equally obtainable when reading from the Mus'haf or from memory. So even if you've memorized it, so basically what he's going to argue is that if you can ponder and venerate the Quran better from memory, do that. But if you have memorized it and you would be equal in your pondering and veneration if you were to recite from a written Mus'haf, then you should do that. That would be better than going by memory because of the combination of the recitation and looking in the Mus'haf as forms of ibadah. So he says, it may be said that this differs according to different people. Reciting from the Mus'haf is the preference of one who finds having veneration of Allah and pondering the Quran equally attainable, whether reading from the Mus'haf or reading from memory. Yet reciting from memory is preferred for someone whose veneration is not complete when reading from the Mus'haf, and thus his veneration and pondering are greater when reading from the heart than when reading from the Mus'haf. So if there's someone who has to concentrate a bit when they recite, and that then takes away from their understanding and comprehension of what they're reading, then memory would be better for that person, okay? And then Imam al-Nawawi says this is a good opinion, and it is clear from the words and the actions of the righteous forebears and he agrees with what they did. Okay, he says this is a good opinion. It is clear that the words and actions of the righteous forebears conform to these details. Okay, the details of distinguishing people based on which means of recitation is going to contribute most to their understanding and veneration of what they're reciting. So, people who read out loud to others, like if we read a book out loud in a lesson, if we're not really familiar with the text, then yes, it can be taxing. A lot of times when you read, you don't understand really what you're doing. Yes, you kind of have a feeling for what it is, but you don't understand it as well as if you had been reading it silently or following along and listening to someone read it. Okay, this is something we probably experience somewhere in our lives, so we can appreciate the distinction that Imam al-Nawawi makes here. Okay, and as always, Allah knows best. This is the end of today's segment, and inshallah tomorrow we're going to get into the issue of reciting the Quran simultaneously in a group or reciting it serially in a group. So we'll get into that issue tomorrow, inshallah. So until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.